Flashman and the Dragon by George MacDonald Fraser, book review. So this is now the 8th book in the Flashman series. I've been reading them in order so far and reviewing them on this channel. Because we're 8 books in at this point, I'm not going to try and explain what the series is or who Flashman is. I'm just going to assume everyone's up to speed at this point. If you're not, you can check out my Flashman playlist, which I'll link to in the description down below, which should give suitable background on exactly what this series is about. But for the purpose of brevity, I'll just say it's historical fiction. If you want any more information, check out the links in the description down below. But this particular book, this book follows England's greatest scoundrel on yet another adventure and shows him yet again engaging in acts of tremendous cowardice, whining, groveling, backstabbing, and womanizing, and somehow managing to come out of it all with a hero's reputation. But in addition to Flashman's usual antics, as always, author George MacDonald Fraser serves up lots of historical details for the history buff to chew on. This book takes place pretty much entirely inside China, aside from a brief epilogue in Singapore at the very end. But there is more than enough happening in China to keep Flashman busy. During the course of the story, Flashman gets mixed up in both the Taiping Rebellion and the Arrow War. Arrow War is also known as the Second Opium War. Now, when I was in college, I took a couple different courses on Chinese history. So I actually studied, albeit briefly, the Taiping Rebellion and the Opium Wars in college. But one thing that either my professor didn't emphasize, or maybe I just wasn't paying attention, I don't know. I never realized that these conflicts were happening concurrently. That is, the Taiping Rebellion was happening at the same time as the Second Opium War. But George MacDonald Fraser brings that through in this book, which I thought was a very fascinating detail I wasn't aware of previously. And interestingly enough, the British diplomats in the British Army were involved in both conflicts. I mean, obviously they were involved in the Second Opium War because they were one of the belligerents, but during the same time that was going on, they were also getting involved in the fighting in the Taiping Rebellion. I'll get more into what each of those are in a second. But just to talk about the scope of this book a minute, one of the strengths of the Flashman series is the eye for interesting historical details that George MacDonald Fraser has. This is not a bland retelling of impersonal armies meeting each other on some obscure field of battle. Fraser has obviously thoroughly done his research, and he has a talent for picking out the more bizarre episodes of history. The kind of stuff that you think is all made up until you check the endnotes in the back of the book and see that it is all documented. And Fraser does a very good job of integrating these historical details into the narrative. For example, there's a true historical incident where a drunken Scottish private is killed for refusing to kowtow to his Chinese captors. It's a true incident from history. It's documented in the footnotes and is integrated into the narrative. Flashman is there to see it happen. Or a party of British diplomats is ambushed and captured by the Chinese government to use as hostages. Turns out Flashman is one of their number. Or a French priest is executed by the Chinese in retaliation for a military defeat. Flashman is the last European to see him alive. It is this eye for fascinating but forgotten history that always makes the Flashman series so interesting to read. Granted, as always, the plot has to be a little bit contrived to get Flashman to all these various events, especially since Flashman, the incurable coward, never goes into any place remotely dangerous of his own accord. So the plot always has to figure out ways to force him into these situations. In just about every Flashman book, there's some episode where he gets captured and taken to a historically significant place against his will, because that's the only way you would get Flashman to one of these major battles. In this book, they make use of that several times. He gets captured several times and taken to a dangerous historical place. But once you forgive these plot contrivances and just go along with it, it can be a lot of fun. In addition to the interesting events, Flashman always manages to meet the most interesting historical figures. And that tradition continues in this book. He is on intimate terms with the leading British diplomats and army generals, Grant, Elgin, Parkes, and Locke. And he meets several of the rising stars of the British Army in China, including Wolseley and Gordon. Now, Wolseley and Gordon were both infamous for the conflict in Sudan during the British expeditions in Africa. And I've already actually talked about them before in my review of the book Three Empires on the Nile by Dominic Green, which is about the British in the Sudan. And I will be talking about them again shortly in my review of The Scramble for Africa, because they both played a very prominent role in the British imperial role in Africa. But I'll get to that in another review. Suffice it to say for now, they were major players in the British expeditions in Africa. Here in China, they are not yet at their height of their fame, but both of them were in China, and both of them were involved in these conflicts, and both of them are integrated into the narrative. Now, Gordon was actually, he made his name in China before his infamous last stand in the Sudan. He was commander of what was called the Ever Victorious Army in China. And Flashman has a couple different run-ins with him, but actually, Gordon was not the original founder of that army. The original founder was an American soldier named Ward, who founded the army. And Fraser in this book claims that Ward was later overshadowed by Charles Chinese Gordon, so that today most people have never even heard of him. But he attempts to rectify that in this book. So the American Ward, the original founder of the Ever Victorious Army, does play a major role in this book. Flashman also meets and gives detailed description of the many leaders of the Taiping Rebellion. Apologies in advance for butchering their names, but Loyal Prince Li, Hung Jing Khan, and the supposed half-brother of Jesus Christ himself, Hong Shu Chan. Now, in the Manchu government, Flashman has an audience with the Son of Heaven, Emperor Xing Feng. He ends up on intimate terms with the woman who would later become the Dowager Emperor of China, and he becomes involved in her power struggles with the other Chinese nobles, Prince Ai and Song Ko In Sen. And in an interlude, in which Flashman travels with female bandit leader Su Zan. And you can see already that this book is packed with so many interesting historical figures and so much historical detail to keep any reader interested. I do have some nitpicks, and I'll get to those in just a minute. But it's just a fascinating, interesting book, even though I'm going to disagree with some of the portrayals. The big takeaway here is there's just so much historical detail and so many interesting characters that I don't see how anyone could not find this book fascinating. Now, I mentioned that this book takes place during both the Taiping Rebellion and the Second Opium War, which it turns out were going on concurrently. First half of the book is about the Taiping Rebellion. Second half is about the Second Opium War and Flashman on the march to Peking, what is now Beijing. Now, the Taiping Rebellion was, again, something I studied briefly in those college courses I took on the history of China. It's a rather bizarre incident in Chinese history. Basically what happened is this is around about the time, the 1850s, 1860s, that Western missionaries, Catholic missionaries, are making their way into Asia. And there's this Chinese guy kind of out in the, I think he was out in the middle of China, somewhere in the interior, who gets a hold of one of these Christian pamphlets and decides that he is actually the half-brother of Jesus Christ. And then he leads a rebellion against the Chinese government, with millions of Chinese peasants kind of flocking to support him, believing that he is the half-brother of Jesus Christ. Now already this is sounding a little bit bizarre, and it's bizarre when you think about it, that this huge turning point in Chinese history, this huge massive rebellion, was predicated on kind of a pseudo-Christian doctrine with a leader who believed himself to be the half-brother of Jesus Christ, right? Because you don't think of Christianity as having that big of impact on China, but here's this major episode in Chinese history, all built around some perversion of Christianity. So that in itself is kind of fascinating. But when I was studying the Taiping Rebellion in my college courses, I never realized the magnitude of it. And I think that's partly, I don't know, maybe it was partly my fault. Maybe the professor tried to emphasize how big a deal this was and I was just half asleep. I don't know. But I think when you take these survey courses, you just study one rebellion after another. I mean, what is the history of China except a series of rebellions against the government and, changing dynasties and stuff like that. So this just seemed like one more rebellion against the dynasty. And I noted it as a rather bizarre incident, but never realized the magnitude of it until I read Flashman and the Dragon, because George MacDonald Fraser, in his endnotes, takes great pains to emphasize how massive this rebellion really was. I'm going to quote from page 293. This is quoting the endnotes here. It said, "The Taiping Rebellion was the worst civil war in history, and the second bloodiest war of any kind, being exceeded in casualties only by the Second World War, with its estimated 60 million dead. How many died during the 14 years of the Taiping Rebellion can only be guessed. The lowest estimate is 20 million, but 30 million is considered more probable, 3 times the total for the First World War. When it is remembered that the Taiping struggle was fought largely with small arms and only primitive artillery, some idea may be gained of the scale of the land fighting with its attendant horrors of massacre and starvation. The bloodiest battle ever fought on earth was the Third Battle of Nanking in 1864, when in 3 days the dead exceeded 100,000. So, wow. I mean, that is fascinating. And, he makes a good point with, talking about World War II. Part of the reason World War II, the casualties were so big, was because we had modern weapons and aerial bombardment and, of course, the nuclear bombs at the end and, Tokyo being bombed to smithereens and all this massive artillery. Whereas back in 1864... to have casualties of 20 or 30 million, imagine the scale of those land battles. It's it's a point he makes in this book, in the endnotes, George MacDonald Fraser, but it bears emphasizing here, this was just huge, and it's really strange that we don't talk about this more. I mean, the only reason I even vaguely knew about it is because I had taken a couple elective courses on Chinese history when I was in college. I would have never heard about this in high school. I mean, I never did hear about this in high school. If I hadn't been a history major in college, I would never even have heard about it. Now, what we do talk about, of course, all the time in the West is the American Civil War and how bloody that was and what an awful conflict was. And that was going on at the same time, 1860s, exactly the same time. So it just goes to show how Western-centric our history education system is. When we're so obsessed with talking about the American Civil War and people don't even know about the Taiping Rebellion. And, think about all the documentaries we have about the American Civil War. I mean, Ken Burns is never going to make like a 10-episode series on the Taiping Rebellion. It's just considered this obscure historical footnote that most normal people don't know about. And yet, it was so much more massive than, well, than almost anything, huh? So, yeah, I mean, that's something to think about. And then also, as I mentioned before, the bizarreness of having this biggest conflict in history being about Christianity in China. And author George MacDonald Fraser brings out this awkwardness fully. Now, since the Flashman books are from the perspective of the British, Fraser shows the split in the European community. Some of the Europeans are actually sympathetic to the Taiping Rebellion, and they favor them as fellow Christians or potential Democrats. However, some of them are anti-Taiping because they regard the movement as a heresy, and there are reports of great cruelty from the Taiping army. The British government tries to maintain an awkward neutrality, but it is forced into the war when the Taiping rebels advance on Nanking. The British had interests in Nanking. The Taipings, for their part, fully expect help from the European nations because they expect to be welcomed as fellow Christians. And they're confused when the Europeans actually side with the Manchu government against them. Now, although he quotes sources from both sides in the endnote, Fraser seems to be of the opinion that the Taiping Rebellion started out as a genuine egalitarian movement, but then quickly developed into a movement that was much more cruel and bloodthirsty than the Manchu government that they sought to replace. Inside the narrative of the book, Flashman is taken on a tour of a Taiping-controlled city, and he sees the contrast between the luxury that the Taiping leaders live in and the poverty in which the ordinary people live. This is quoting from Flashman the narrator on page 105. Flashman says, "I made a mental salute to the Taiping Rebellion. Like all revolutionary movements, and for that matter all governments, it was plainly designed to ensure the rulers an abundance of flesh pot, while convincing the ruled that austerity was good for the soul. But barring the papists, I couldn't think of a regime that had the business so nicely in hand as this one." End quote. Now, if that sounds like it's a little bit of shade, I think it's fairly obvious you're meant to think of the Chinese communists when Flashman is talking about the Taiping Rebellion. And if it wasn't obvious enough, author George MacDonald Fraser draws a comparison between the Taiping Revolution and the Chinese Communist Party even more clearly in the footnotes. Quoting from the endnotes now at page 310. "One revolution is probably very much like another, and readers of Flashman's narrative will no doubt detect resemblances between Taipingdom and Communist China a few decades later. It's Communist China a few decades ago. The Taipings were, of course, a socialist movement. The pronouncements of the Heavenly King seem to have been received with the same kind of reverence later accorded to the thoughts of Chairman Mao. So it's a reminder of how quickly revolutionary movements, even idealistic revolutionary movements, have of turning into brutal dictatorships. This was true even before the communist revolutions of the 20th century, as illustrated here with the Taiping Rebellion. And I think it's a cautionary note for those of us who are inclined to support ideologies that have a revolutionary rhetoric. Now, Fraser makes this point about comparing like the Taiping Rebellion and their pseudo-socialism with the later Chinese Communist Party. I think there's another point he could make, and he doesn't make this point, or at least he doesn't make it explicitly, but I don't know. When I was reading this book, I was going through a phase where I was going through my Christopher Hitchens phase, where I was becoming increasingly skeptical of the Christianity that I had grown up with. And I thought this, in addition to being a lesson about how revolutionary movements can get subverted so quickly, I thought this could also easily be an object lesson in how messianic movements can spring up so easily. I mean, if millions of Chinese peasants were able to believe that this guy was the half-brother of Jesus Christ and, was the Messiah come back to earth, and obviously they were mistaken, right? I mean, everybody believes that he wasn't really the half-brother of Jesus Christ. But so many people believed it at the time, at least so many peasants in China. Just by historical analogy, it makes you think how easily also it could have been for the Messianic movement around Jesus Christ to have been completely mistaken or deluded. Sorry, I know that's a little bit of an anti-Christian polemic, but it's something you can't help think about, right? When reading about the Taiping Rebellion or hearing about the Taiping Rebellion. Okay, anyways, moving on. The second half of this book moves away from the Taiping Rebellion and talks about the Second Opium War, sometimes known as the Arrow War, which were the British and the French in alliance with each other, fighting against the Chinese and advancing on Peking, and then culminating in the burning of the emperor's summer palace in Peking. Now, nowadays, this is considered one of the greatest vandalisms in history. The fact that these imperial British and French armies, who didn't have any right to be in China, certainly didn't have any right to force the Chinese to buy opium, thought they had the right to march up to Peking and burn this great historical building, the Emperor's Summer Palace. It is regarded nowadays, I think rightly, as a huge historical injustice. Even at the time, it was controversial, I believe. For example, Karl Marx in his Civil War in France, a book I've reviewed on this channel, talks about how the capitalist government commits acts of vandalism abroad and then is surprised when when they have uprisings at home. So Karl Marx already in 1870, just a few years after that happened, was making that comparison. Now, George MacDonald Fraser shows all the events that led up to the burning of the Summer Palace, and he even recreates in this novel the debate surrounding the decision. By the end of it all, you can understand why the British Army makes the decision that it did, even if you don't entirely agree with it. It almost seems like a completely rational decision in light of everything that happened, all the provocations by the Manchu government. Almost, that is. If you overlook the tiny detail that the British and the French armies really didn't have any right to be in Peking in the first place. And this context is what is lacking from George MacDonald Fraser's book. Somehow, with all his many historical notes, he never gets around to talking about the origins of the Second Opium War and the flimsy justification by which the British and French armies claimed the right to march on Peking. And that brings me to the last point I want to make. At times, this book does seem to have an anti-Chinese bias. There are very few sympathetic Chinese characters in the book, and both the Manchus and the Taiping characters are portrayed as either being insane or sadistic or Machiavellian. Now, granted, this particular era of Chinese history is not one of the high points of Chinese history. I mean, the Taipings really were religious fanatics, and the Manchu government really was incredibly corrupt. But I couldn't help feeling that a more sympathetic novelist would have tried to humanize what was going on, instead of simply typecasting the Chinese in the role of the exotic other. Once again, author George MacDonald Fraser seems to be engaged in Orientalism. I say once again because this is a criticism I've made of the other Flashman books. Engaged in Orientalism, in which instead of seeking to understand the Chinese, he seeks to exaggerate the differences in order to create a strange and mysterious land for his European characters to have adventures in. By contrast, all the European leaders are portrayed as honorable gentlemen. Grant, Elgin, Parkes, Locke, Wolseley, etc. are all portrayed as respecting an honorable code of war and diplomacy that is completely absent from the Chinese side. Flashman himself, of course, is portrayed as being a completely reprehensible human being, but that's the joke of this series. That's a running gag of this series, that Flashman himself is always completely reprehensible. But the satire on Flashman does not, in this book, extend to the Victorian imperial culture. It's just a satire on Flashman himself. I felt that in some of the previous books, the satire was a little bit more broad. That is, the satire wasn't just about Flashman, it was about the whole British army or the whole imperial mindset. But in this book, the satire just seems to be about the character of Flashman himself, and the rest of the British are all portrayed as noble and diplomatic and honorable and etc. Now, I'm actually no expert. I'm a bit of a history buff, but I'm not a historian or an expert by any means. I did, however, at the time I was reading this book, have another book I was working my way through, which is The Decline and Fall of the British Empire by Piers Brendon. And I'll review that book eventually in a separate video. But I just want to quote what he said about the Second Opium War. He said, quote, "The Chinese put up a strong resistance, which was rewarded by corresponding carnage. Women were raped and men were ritually humiliated. Their queues, which were their long pigtails, were cut off and they were made to kowtow." That's from page 108 of The Decline and Fall of the British Empire by Piers Brendon. Now, this view is completely absent from the Flashman book. In Fraser's retelling, all the inhumanity and barbarity is all entirely on the Chinese side. The looting of the summer palace by the British and French soldiers is described, but that's about it. And even in this case, Fraser goes out of his way to quote Wolseley, who suspected that the Chinese villagers plundered more than the British and French forces. Yeah, I don't know. as I've been saying all along with these reviews, I'm not exactly sure what George MacDonald Fraser's politics are. If he shifted politics later in life, or if this had been his view all along.